Okay, now we're discussing section 5 on tissue organization, now looking at the integration of tissues in the organs and the body membranes. And things you should be able to do after this section is to define an organ, explain the roles of different tissues in an organ, explain the structure and functions of mucous, serous, cutaneous, and synovial membranes, and identify the locations of these membranes. So with organs, there are two or more tissue types, right? Tissues compose organs. They work together to form specific complex functions. There are different structures that must work in concert, like the stomach, which contains all four tissue types. The stomach itself is lined by epithelium. It secretes substances for chemical digestion of nutrients. The areolar and dense connective tissue in the walls include the blood vessels and the nerves. It provides shape and support. There are 3 layers of smooth muscle in the walls. They contract and relax to mix stomach contents. An abundant nervous tissue, there is abundant nervous tissue there, I should say, responsible for regulating the muscle contraction and gland secretion. So looking at this image here, showing the stomach itself and then showing the tissue breakdown here, we have showing here the epithelial tissue, specifically looking at the simple columnar epithelium and the areolar connective tissue in here inside the columns. The gastric glands, you can see there. And then let me get a little closer look here, actually. So you can see the gastric gland there. And then this all the way through here, I should say. And the nerve ending at the end for sensing and receiving information. Then looking over here, the mucosa as well, playing a role with that there. And with dense irregular connective tissue, you can also, I should bring it back out again, connective tissue showing nice little diagrams. You can see the different tissue types, nervous, connective, epithelial, or muscular. And that dense irregular tissue here, the nerve plexus there. And then the oblique layer, circular layer, longitudinal layer for the smooth muscle, 3 different layers, in this case with the stomach. The nerve plexus between each, which makes sense, be able to innervate different levels. And the areolar down here, the connective tissue, and the mesothelium, simple squamous epithelium, thin layer with that serous membrane. As far as body membranes, they're formed from epithelial layer bound to underlying connective tissue. They line all body cavities. They cover viscera, and they cover body's external surface as well. And the 4 types are mucous, serous, cutaneous, and synovial. So look at the mucous membrane here first. Looking at that in the basically related to the nose, and there's in the head, and the lumen opening here of the organ with the mucus, epithelium, connective tissue, serous membrane, pointing more to what you'd see around the heart, typically, or the lung, excuse me, here, with serous fluid going here, and epithelium, and then the connective tissue on the outer layer, right, and the parietal layer versus the visceral layer, right. Visceral being deeper and parietal being more toward the surface. Cutaneous membrane, we're looking for more of the skin here, open to the exterior, right? And then the epithelium, upper layer, or the outermost layer, I should say, with connective tissue below, and synovial membranes, which you find in joints, specifically in this case here, the knee, where 2 bones meet, and along with a lot of connective tissue there, we also have a synovial membrane, synovial fluid, often referred to them as synovial joints, and connective tissue. So the mucous membrane, where the mucosa exists, it lines compartments that open to the external environment, the digestive, the respiratory, the urinary, and reproductive tracts, performs absorptive, protective, and secretory functions, and it's formed from the epithelium and underlying connective tissue, and that connective tissue component is the lamina propria. It's covered with a layer of mucus derived from the goblet cells, with multicellular glands or both. The serous membrane lines body cavities that do not open to the external environment. They're simple squamous epithelium, very thin, right? The mesothelium in this case. They produce thin, watery serous fluid. They're derived from blood plasma, and they produce friction between opposing surfaces, which is obviously important. It forms the parietal and visceral layers and the serous cavities between. The cutaneous membrane is the skin. It covers the external surface of the body. It's composed of the keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium, and it includes the underlying connective tissue below it. It protects the internal organs and prevents water loss. And the synovial membrane lines some joints in the body. It's composed of the areolar connective tissue covered by squamous epithelial cells lacking the basement membrane. And then the synovial fluid is secreted by the epithelial cells. It reduces friction among the moving bone parts and distributes nutrients to the cartilage. So, you should be able to describe why the stomach is considered an organ, and what are the differences between the parietal and visceral layers of the serous membrane. Our last section is on tissue development and aging, and you should be able to explain the stages of the tissue development in the embryo. You should be able to describe the 3 primary germ layers and the tissues to which they give rise. Describe how tissues may change in form, size, or number of cells, and list some changes that occur in tissues with age. So with stages of tissue development, the oocyte is fertilized by a sperm, then it forms diploid cell and zygote. After multiple cell divisions, it becomes a blastocyst, and the cells form an embryo. It's called embryoblast. And the 3 primary germ layers that are formed by the 3rd week are the ectoderm, mesoderm, and the endoderm, and the growing structure is now an embryo. With ectoderm, it's initially located on the dorsal and external embryo surfaces. It's responsible for forming many external surfaces, and it's the epidermis on the skin, the hair, the nails, exocrine glands. But some, but not all, epithelial tissues are derived from the ectoderm. Okay? Other structures that are derived also tooth enamel, your eye lens, your adrenal medulla, and all nervous tissue. We'll take a look at these here shortly too. Mesoderm is a middle primary germ layer, forms all muscle tissue. It forms the epithelial lining of vessels and serous membranes, becomes mesenchyme. And it later forms in all connective tissue in the body. And other mesoderm-derived structures include the dermis, the adrenal cortex, the heart, the spleen, kidneys, and ureters, and other internal reproductive structures. And the endoderm becomes the innermost germ layer. The structures are derived: epithelial linings of the tympanic cavity and the auditory tube, epithelial linings of the digestive, respiratory, reproductive, and urinary tract, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, the thymus, portions of the palatine tonsils, and most of the liver, gallbladder, and the pancreas. So here we go. I'll get a better look at it now. So we see a fertilization, come the zygote, then a blastocyst. You see with the embryoblast in the 3rd week, we have the ectoderm here, and the mesoderm and endoderm. Late week 4, we have an embryo, and you see an ectoderm here, separating that from the endoderm being the innermost, okay, and the mesoderm being between, with the amniotic cavity connecting the stalk here and the yolk sac of that embryo. And the endoderm is the epithelial lining, remember, of the respiratory tract and other surfaces. Dermis of the skin is where mesoderm, and the lining of blood vessels and lymph vessels, serous membranes, and ectoderm is for the skin and the epidermal derivatives. Okay, but you can see all in an embryo, right? So tissue modification. Hypertrophy is the increase in size of existing cells of a tissue. Hyperplasia is an increase in number of cells of a tissue. Atrophy is the shrinkage of tissue by decreasing the cell number or size with normal aging or disuse, like a bedridden individual. Skeletal muscle fibers become smaller. You're also going to lose some fibers too. If it goes over a lengthy period of time, you'll actually see not just atrophy, but you'll see a loss of fibers as well, not just size. It's reversible, potentially, by physical therapy, at least to some extent. Should be. Now, clinical view of stem cells. Seeing embryonic stem cells versus adult stem cell. The embryonic stem cell is from the dividing cells, the zygote or the embryoblast, or the blastocyst, right? And we're not going to get too much into totipotent or pluripotent just yet. Well, we'll cover a little bit here real briefly. Totipotent, the stem cells are those cells formed from the zygote. They can give rise to every differentiated cells in the organism and the placenta. Okay. Pluripotent, stem cells are derived from the embryoblast portion of the blastocyst. Okay. And this stem cell has the capability to mature and specialize into a cell, any tissue in the body, except the placenta. Okay. The adult stem cells are the undifferentiated stem cells in the body after birth. They may be multipotent or unipotent. The multipotent stem cells, like red bone marrow, are capable of differentiating into a restricted number of some cell types, but not others. Okay, in the red bone marrow of the cells. The unipotent stem cells, like the epithelial stem cells, they have the ability to differentiate into a single type of cell. Okay. Tissue modification, metaplasia. It's a change of mature epithelium to a different form that can occur as the epithelium adapts to the environment, like smokers. They experience metaplastic changes in the trachea epithelium. Normal pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium is changed, becomes non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. It'll revert back quickly if a person quits smoking. Interesting to note what happens there when someone's smoking affecting the tissues. Now, dysplasia is abnormal tissue development, maybe precancerous, or it can revert back to normal. Must be closely monitored by professionals. Cervical dysplasia is due to exposure to human papillomavirus. Excuse me. Neoplasia, tissue growth is out of control. Tumor of abnormal tissue develops. If it's benign, it's localized growth and it doesn't spread. If it's malignant, it metastasizes. It spreads and invades other tissues, like cancer. It can interfere with normal functioning and lead to death, potentially. Malignant is not something we want, right? Necrosis is tissue death. It's due to irreversible tissue damage. There's an inflammatory response to tissue damage, like gangrene. And we'll talk about gangrene. Gangrene is a necrosis of soft tissues of a body part due to diminished arterial blood supply. Blood's not getting there adequately. Most common in your limbs, fingers, and toes. There are major complications of diabetes, potentially. Okay? Intestinal gangrene involves the obstruction of blood supply to the intestines. If untreated, it leads to death. If there's dry gangrene, the involved part is desiccated and shriveled. It's usually due to extreme cold. Wet gangrene is caused by a bacterial infection of tissues with loss of blood supply. And ruptured dying cells release fluid, allowing black bacteria to flourish. Or gas gangrene, where bacteria invade the necrotic tissue and bacteria produces gas bubbles. Okay? All tissues change with aging. Proper nutrition, good health, normal circulation, and frequent wounds, which we'll talk about all these things. We'll do more case studies as we move on through some of these areas. Not this section, but we will down the road. All promote normal functioning. So we want to be able to put it all together, right? So they provide support, maintenance, replacement of cells, and extracellular matrix. They're less efficient after middle age. Tissues in general are. Where I am, 49, I'll be 50 next month. Structure and chemical composition of many tissues is altered. Epithelium thins. Connective tissue loses pliability and resiliency. Collagen declines. Muscles atrophy. Fibers can also be lost. And bones become brittle. So, what are the three primary germ layers? When do they form? Should be able to answer. What's the difference between metaplasia, dysplasia, and malignant neoplasia? And how do epithelia and connective tissue change when we age? And that's chapter 5 on tissue organization.